If people can have a coffee table for their coffee, I don't see why I can't have a pizza table for my pizza. This is my submission for the Rockler Hobby Challenge. Our friends at the Modern Maker podcast are using this as an opportunity for people to show their hobbies and or interests, which means that this is my chance to show my hobby of recreating other foods. I started with the tabletop. I figured if I'm going to make a pizza table, I need a platform for it. 1x6 boards worked perfectly for me, but feel free to use whatever you want. In a second, we're going to join all these boards together using a Miles Craft doweling jig. To plan for this, I marked out the location that I wanted every dowel to be at. Then I used those lines as a reference point for my doweling jig kit. This little tool makes it super easy to perfectly center a dowel hole, which is going to make all the boards easy to join. I clamped 2 mating boards together and then started filling in the dowel holes. With those in place, you can reference the thickness of the board using the red lip on the doweling jig. This way, when you drill the hole into the mating piece, the boards are perfectly lined up. Right before you glue up, make sure you clean up your work area because these pieces tend to get stuck between the boards. When your dowels get stuck for the glue up, you can use a pair of pliers to take them out. That's right, not if, but when they get stuck. And if one of them happens to break, you can just re-drill that hole. Now, joining the boards should be pretty straightforward. Just be sure to put a thin layer of wood glue between all the boards, and don't forget to put some on the dowels too, since these are a big source of strength. I pieced together my boards one by one, and then I moved over to the clamps, applied some pressure, and let this dry overnight. The next day, I had my tabletop. We're going to turn this into a round tabletop, so I measured and marked out the center. It's also worth noting, I was working on the bottom side at this point. I grabbed a straight piece of scrap plywood, then I drilled a screw through that and anchored it to the center of the table. This created a rotation that would ultimately make a perfect circle. Then I drilled a hole at the other end of that piece of plywood to make room for my pen. This method allowed me to perfectly outline a big circle. And once that outline was created, it was pretty easy to cut off any excess wood. This will leave less material for the router to take off in 1 second. While we're on the topic, be very careful with your router because they tend to be dangerous. Jokes aside, I started prepping my router with a straight bit. Then I anchored my router to that rotational piece of plywood using 2 screws. I made sure the straight bit was pretty close to the line, and then I started routing. I took this in very thin passes to try to keep the circle as perfect as possible. This took a pretty long time, but on the bright side, I had an awesome mess to clean up afterwards. On a side note, I actually messed up a little bit and I had to make my table smaller. This was not so great for the table size, but I guess it would still be a pretty big sized pizza, so there's that. So at this point in the build, we have our pizza platform. Now we have to give it a crust and some toppings. The first step here is to mark out our cut lines for the router. I made a cross at the center initially, and then I used a wooden board cut to 45 degrees to make the other marks. And when I said cut lines earlier, I was actually referring to the lines for each pizza slice. I grabbed a wooden board, clamped it to the table, and used it as a guide for my router. And to leave a nice indentation, I used a grooving bit, since this would give us enough space for the epoxy to sit in. Then using that same bit, I started testing out some of the shapes for my toppings. I wanted the pizza to have an organic feel, maybe not in ingredients, but more so in shapes and sizes. With that in mind, I freehanded all the drawings so that each shape would be unique. After that, I turned into the human CNC and I started carving all these shapes out. Remember that this footage is very fast forwarded, so if you were to ever try this, please take your time. After all that nonsense, I removed any remaining parts with a chisel. Then I sanded the tabletop to 180 grits, and I made sure to hand sand all the small details just for a smooth finish. Alright, so I have my pizza right here, and we're going to use some alcohol ink to color the epoxy. And now we can appreciate the way that it kind of looks like an old school rap music video. 1, 2, 3 into the 4. Now we can mix our epoxy with our alcohol ink to make the toppings. This epoxy comes with 2 containers and they work under a 1-to-1 ratio. This means you have to mix an equal amount of part A and part B in order for this epoxy to activate. Once I had my mix, I threw in blue and yellow alcohol ink in order to make green peppers. Once the color was made, I used this little plastic pipette that came in the kit in order to fill all the peppers. Then I mixed blue, red, and yellow to make a dark brown for the mushrooms. The red for the pepperoni was given since it is one of our colors. It was really exciting to see this start coming together, but I still had 2 toppings left. For the sausage, I just did a darker brown than last time using the same color combination. Last but not least, for the olives, I kind of just mixed all the colors until it was dark enough to look like one. And when working with epoxy, it's always a good idea to go over it with a heat gun because this will release any air bubbles that are trapped inside. Once the toppings were done, I let them dry overnight, and then I came back the next day to fill the dividing lines with some orange epoxy. I figured that making an outline of each pizza slice would help it stand out a little bit more. Once everything cured again the next day, I sanded the tabletop with 180 grit sandpaper. This sanding finish actually isn't going to give the epoxy a good shine, which means that we have to go back and individually sand each topping with 1000 grit sandpaper. I had to do a lot of hand sanding, so I made sure the sandpaper was wet just to make this a little bit more smooth. Once I was done, I started outlining my crust. This is just a little guideline so that when I start laying out my crust, I have something to go by. The idea here is to put a bunch of little wooden blocks together and make sure that every part of the crust we drew is covered up. You'll also notice there's a little line between each connecting piece. This is going to let you know where the dowels go. The top piece is a handmade doweling jig and the bottom piece is my crust. The little doweling jig is literally a block of wood with a perfectly centered hole and a corresponding line. Using this jig made it super easy to join all my pieces of crust. From this point, I just drilled a hole into the crust, which doesn't really show up on camera, but you get the idea. And just like earlier, I started putting wood glue on all the boards, and then I put in the corresponding dowel. It took a little while, but I continued doing this until my crust outline was completely covered. Then I clamped it together and let it dry overnight so that it can be flat and keep its shape for the next day. Once it was dry, I clamped it to my work surface and I tried to remove as much excess material as I could. This is once again to hopefully make it easier for my router to remove material later. With the piece still clamped, I put a straight bit on my router and I started carving out the inside. I wanted the inside to once again have an organic feel to it, just like a real pizza crust, so I freehanded this as well. Doing this gives the crust a nice waviness that I think pretty much imitates a real crust. Now we can see that the outside is still a little rough, so we're going to have to work on that. I secured the crust to the pizza using a screw, which is probably something you thought you'd never hear, and then I used a flush trim router bit to make the crust match the size of the pizza. These router bits have bearings on them which reference the size of your original piece and just remove the excess. Then I came back with a roundover bit and used it on both the inside and outside of the crust just to give it a more smooth feel. I took the crust back off and then stained it with Verithane's Early American because I felt that this would be the best color for it. And naturally, the bottom of the table got the same treatment because it needs to be consistent with the outside crust. I gave that some time to dry and then I started laying out some 16-inch hairpin legs. I wanted the legs to be nice and simple so they don't take anything away from the pizza design-wise. Securing these is super simple since they just use a Phillips head screw. And for the stain on top of the pizza, I just used Minwax's Colonial Maple, since this was a fairly natural looking color, but not too excessive. After securing the crust one more time, I added some of Verithane's water-based polyurethane to add extra protection. I coated the entire thing 3 times. Since this is a coffee table, it's very likely it's going to get a lot of contact. Give this a few hours to dry, and your project is done.